Could Libya's civil war become a regional conflict? Turkey, with the backing of Algeria, deploying military advisors to Tripoli to support the internationally recognized government of Fayez al-Sarraj. Is Ankara going all in? If so, it's got its work cut out. What with Muammar Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte falling into the hands of Eastern-based strongman Khalifa Haftar. Haftar, who's got the backing of Egypt, the UAE and Russian mercenaries. We'll ask about the role of France, accused of backing Haftar, and former colonial power Italy, part of a diplomatic flurry that's got foreign ministers opposed to Turkey's moves in the Mediterranean, meeting Wednesday in Cairo. Now, this all has the trimmings of a proxy war that's on top of a humanitarian crisis. Can cooler heads prevail, or will it spin out of control and draw in players from the region and beyond? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the escalation in Libya. Joining us from London, Anas El-Gamadi, founder of the Sadek Institute think tank. Thanks for joining us. From Rome, where we welcome Claudio Gazzini, consulting analyst for international crisis group who focuses on Libya. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Journalist Rumiana Ugarczynska is the co-author in French of, how do you translate, For the Skin of Gaddafi?
Yes. For the Skin of Gaddafi.
About the fall of the late Libyan leader.
No, it's the history of the opposition to Gaddafi, how they tried to fight him for 40 years.
All right. And with us from Istanbul, Borzu Dargahi, correspondent for The Independent. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
It's a pleasure, always.
And you can weigh in on what we're talking about on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is F24Debate. Yeah, Tripoli's government this Tuesday calling it a strategic withdrawal to avoid bloodshed. That's how they characterize the fact that General Haftar's forces are now firmly in control of Sirte. Let's begin with this report by Yuka Royer.
Claiming to have captured Sirte, the birthplace of the late dictator Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan National Army is keen to proclaim its success.
With a swift blow from our courageous men, the Sirte Liberation Operations Unit has managed to completely control the city. We have cleansed it and returned it to the bosom of our homeland.
If they could maintain control of Sirte, it would mark a major win for the LNA, led by General Khalifa Haftar, in their 9-month military campaign. April 2019, Haftar ordered his troops to advance on Tripoli, seat since 2016 of the internationally recognized Government of National Accord, or GNA. Haftar's forces briefly seized the capital's airport. By that time, the LNA, headquartered in Tobruk, already controlled a vast majority of the country and nearly all of its oil fields. But in late June, government forces delivered a major blow to Haftar's group by retaking the town of Garian, the LNA's major supply base in the west. In November, Russia was reported to have sent mercenaries to Libya to support Haftar. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and others also backed the rebel forces. Meanwhile, Turkey signed a deal with Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj's government to help it fend off the LNA's offensive. As Ankara started deploying troops at the start of the year, the UN Special Envoy voiced his anger over foreign interference.
Take your hands out of Libya. The country is suffering too much from foreign interference in different ways.
More than 280 civilians have been killed and tens of thousands of people have been displaced since the start of the Tripoli offensive.
Borzu Dargahi, we saw at the beginning of last April there was this plan that was afoot, UN brokered, to have a UN brokered deal to come to an end of having these dueling governments. It looked like some kind of compromise was perhaps possible. Instead, General Haftar launched that offensive. Would you say that the taking of Sirte could be a turning point?
I don't think it will be. I think Sirte is an unusual place. It's an important location, but it's an unusual place in the Libyan chessboard. What would be calamitous and more game-changing is if the forces of Haftar tried to use their control of Sirte to make a lunge toward Misrata and to try to take that city, which is, kind of endemically hostile to Haftar's project, very strongly allied with Turkey, deep roots to the Ottoman times, and so on. And that would be much more significant. This particular battle for Sirte, it wasn't much of a battle. Someone changed sides through bribery or some other kind of deal-making, and the militia that controlled the city, or mostly controlled it, handed it over to Haftar's forces. It was that kind of thing, rather than this courageous, heroic battle that Haftar's spokesperson described.
Rumina Ugarczynska, I see you shaking your head. What do you think happened in Sirte?
I think that what happened in Sirte was expected because of what happened before in Sirte. Because Sirte, yes, it is the birthplace of Gaddafi, and it is a city where you have most of the population belonging to Gaddafi tribe and to Farjan tribe. The Farjan tribe is the tribe of Khalifa Haftar, and Gaddafi tribe, the tribe of Gaddafi, but all of them are what we call Gaddafist, mean supporters to Gaddafi until the last hour. But it was expected because after the revolution, Misrata militia crashed on Sirte, and the population really suffered for some times, and that's why even they opened their arms to Daesh. They welcomed Daesh. They preferred Daesh than the militias. They paid that very heavily after that. So this story of Sirte is just making understandable.
So why did Sirte fall?
It's understandable that now they just opened the doors to the army because they just want the Misrati militia to go out of the town, and it is for a while.
Anas El-Gamadi, is that your reading of what happened in Sirte?
Well, yes, partially. I think it's an interesting one because the move has been given a certain optic by Khalifa Haftar, and I think it's this idea that they've come to liberate the town of Sirte, which is partially true. I think the Misratans there were not necessarily friends of the local population, even though and despite the fact that they led a US and UK-backed campaign to liberate it from ISIS in 2016. But there is that city is deeply disillusioned with over 8 to 9 years now of instability, conflict, which they paid the brunt for in November 2011, October 2011, when Gaddafi used it as his last bastion, last stronghold, and it was pelted. And I think Misratan ground forces, NATO air forces there did a lot of damage, and there was not much goodwill and good faith that was brought back in to kind of rebuild the city. But I would say that what's interesting is that Khalifa Haftar's pictures were not hung up in the streets. The flag of the LNA emblem was not hung up in the streets when Khalifa Haftar's forces arrived. They raised the green flag, and I think that shows you this city is going to be very difficult, because we should remember that Khalifa Haftar was involved in the revolution in 2011, and many of the Gaddafis today find that he is a traitor, so to speak, in their eyes. And I think he's going to find it very hard to consolidate control there. But they were disillusioned with the Misratan brigades there. It was a loss that was coming, as your other guests have already said.
Claudia Gazzini, there's another explanation that I've heard. Tell me if there's any credence to it, which is, well, a reaction to the fact that the Turks have announced this arrival of military advisors and militiamen from Syria.
No, I wouldn't explain the advance of Haftar-led forces into Sirte as an immediate reaction. I mean, they've had their eyes on Sirte for a long time. Many of the military in Haftar ranks do come from Sirte, and in fact, some of the armed groups that were in Sirte working with Misrata had some of their members defect 2 years ago and operate under Haftar. I think what has been happening is that in recent weeks we've seen an upsurge of vocal and public statements by former regime members supporting Haftar. The news of Turkish intervention made space for some of these former regime members to come out, denounce the Turkish, what they call the Turkish aggression, and show support to Haftar's cause. So I think this is what triggered more popular support in Sirte, which is a bastion of Gaddafi supporters, and the LNA advance.
All right, and we can call up that map again, Claudio Gazzini, and we see on it that Sirte is located along the coastline there in the middle between the east and the west, and not too far off from Misrata. Once again, explain to us why Misrata matters so much in all that's happened since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011.
Misrata is Libya's second largest city, and it is really the power center of Libyan armed groups. In the 2011 war, Misratan armed groups were key in bringing down Gaddafi's regime. In 2014, when the country split politically, Misratan armed groups were key in supporting the Tripoli-based government against the nascent Libyan National Army led by Khalifa Haftar. In today's war, Misrata is a key military player in lending its support to the GNA, the Tripoli-based authority, and in attempting to fend off the advance of Haftar. So the fact that now we have Haftar forces in Sirte, which is just 200 kilometers away from Misrata, is perceived by Misrata as a huge threat. We have to remember that Sirte has a very strategic airbase that Haftar forces presumably will use very soon to stage perhaps aerial strikes.
Aerial strikes, and just to describe for us with what weapons, what means, who's flying those planes?
Well, there's a lot of ambiguity, intentional ambiguity within the LNA ranks over what they are flying and who's flying them. There are some inherited planes inherited from the Gaddafi era, which the LNA operates. They have some Libyan pilots, but of late we've seen the use of foreign pilots operating these Libyan planes. We've seen drones, Chinese-made, Emirati-operated, allegedly, drones that are striking targets of the Tripoli-based government forces. So it's a mix of Libyan LNA forces and capacity with strong component of foreign backing.
Strong. Is that how you see the mix, Borzu Daragahi?
I mean, on the Haftar side, the ground forces are mostly Libyans of various tribes and regions, many not from the west, but from the east, maybe even from the south. There are some recruits, mercenaries, Sudanese fighters in the ranks. And yes, a lot of the air power is operated by foreign forces on both sides. We had an incident of a American military contractor shot down by Haftar's forces that was ostensibly hired by the government in Tripoli, and it's fairly obvious that the United Arab Emirates is providing sophisticated air support via drones and so on, and that the Turkish advisors, Turkish consultants, military personnel are operating and training people to use drones as well for the government side.
What's it all about, Anas El Gamadi? Why are all these foreign players in there on both sides?
Well, it's certainly one that we shouldn't wrench from its context. I mean, Turkey has involved itself over the last coming months, but foreign air support has been critical to Haftar's move from a tiny little foothold in eastern Libya to where he stands now today in Tarhuna, only 90 or 100 kilometers away from Tripoli. So it's an interesting one that when we look at the foreign air support, I would say it's entirely dominated by the Emiratis. I mean, there were some MiG-23s that were being used by the LNA's Air Force in early April, May and June, but they were downed by the GNA forces, by manpads. And so I think that's almost entirely done for them. So it's been really the drones that, according even to the New York Times, are responsible for around 2/3 of the death toll in Tripoli. So it's certainly one that has become one that is really a war that is really dominated from the sky. The ambition, I would say, is an interesting one. I think if you look at the UAE's broader strategy in the region, It supported the return of authoritarianism in Egypt. It's attempted to do the same thing in Sudan, Algeria. It's part of a wider a kind of fear, an existential fear for them, I think, of the Arab Spring. It's certainly not one that, in terms of geographical location and proximity, Libya causes any kind of interest or danger to them. But I think they have really backed the return of this wind of authoritarianism over the last couple of years, and they've been bombing Tripoli since April 4th. So I would say that that's where the air forces and the ground force. We saw at the beginning of the April 4th move, we saw lots of different Libyan members of the LNA coming into Tripoli with their selfie sticks, lots of different videos all over social media. That's dried up, and that's dried up for a reason, because the majority of that operation now is being held by the Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries that have been almost in control for the last few months, and we see almost little to none of those videos that are emerging anymore, because the leadership of the ground forces is almost entirely foreign. Janjaweed have been well documented, at least by the foreign press and by those that are looking into lobbying contracts in the US, but over 1,000 or so Janjaweed rapid support forces that came from Hameti, or General Hameti in Sudan, have arrived into Libya over the last couple of months. It doesn't look very Libyan to me in terms of what the forces on the ground or even in the skies look like right now.
Romania Ugarczynska?
The reality is not what we can see on Facebook and social media. The reality is on the ground. I spend quite long time on the ground on both sides, and even with the LNA when they were fighting on Benghazi front line against Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. What I can say is that it is a Libyan army. There is soldiers from all over Libya. I spent also a lot of time with the Libyan Air Forces. So saying that they do not have air forces is not true at all. They have air forces. They have a lot of aircrafts from they repaired, they refreshed, and so on. So they have air bases all over Libya, because the war is in Libya. Against
so it's not
Islamist groups before. It was made by the air. It is not a ground.
It's not Emirati, Egyptian backing?
No. And they have a lot of pilots. And they even had some pilots which were trained in Jordan, in Egypt, but they are Libyans. So saying that they do not have air force, it's not true. And even the Turkish say that they dominate the air on the Libyan conflict. So there is, and regarding the presence of Emirates, of Russians, first technicians, it's known for 5 years. They are on the ground and they are helping the LNA for 5 years. So now saying that the international community is discovering that, it is a kind of hypocrisy, And also it is known that Turkey was sending weapons through the sea to the armed groups fighting against Haftar in Benghazi and in Derna, and sometimes going through Misrata. It was documented also by the UNAFOR Med, the European missions in the Mediterranean. So all this is present. And all this foreign interference is present for 5 years now. It increased now because of the conflict and the war in Tripoli. And now you know that weapons are pouring in Misrata and in Tripoli. That's the reality.
We're going to take a quick break. We're going to pick up on this point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the escalation in Libya with, from London, Anas Al-Gammati, founder of the SADC Institute think tank. We're joined from Rome by Claudio Gazzini, consulting analyst for International Crisis Group. Journalist Rumiana Ugarczynska is the co-author of For the Skin of Gaddafi, book published in French. And from Istanbul, Borzu Dargahi, international correspondent for a British daily newspaper, The Independent. We were talking before the break about just how much foreign support each side has. Let me ask you, Claudio Gazzini, is it even when you look at the firepower on both sides?
Well, no, I wouldn't say so. The support that has been offered to Haftar-led forces by Arab states and Russia has, first of all, been longer over time. Support started in 2015 and is ongoing during the war. And it's much broader in terms of countries that are offering support, assistance, training, compared to the Tripoli-based authorities and the military factions allied to it. In a certain sense, Turkey has started to support Tripoli with weapons, armed drones, 2 months into the conflict, so at the beginning of the summer, actually. And only now it's taking a more prominent, open, direct involvement. But actually the deployment of Turkish forces is still minimum. We have news of possible Turkish allied forces, allegedly from Syria, fighting under Turkish command, being deployed to Libya. But the numbers are so far still small. We have to really see what type of deployment will actually pan out in the upcoming weeks.
And can Turkey do that? Can it ferry militiamen from Syria to Libya?
Well, President Erdogan, in his remarks just a few days ago, said explicitly that he will not be sending Turkish troops to Libya, and that he will be using allied Turkish friends, which is presumed to be forces that are Turkmen forces from northern Syria. And in Tripoli, there are reports circulating of the arrival of these forces, which obviously the Tripoli-based government denies. So there's some ambiguity, but they can ship them in, fly them in. I think that's the easiest part. The hardest part is air support, anti-aircraft technology, but just shipping in people, that's easy in Libya.
All right, before the troop deployment came that shock announcement of a trade deal between Turkey and Tripoli last month, one that would most notably give the Turks exclusive rights to territorial waters in the Mediterranean. And that has traditional rivals like Greece and Cyprus on edge. Selena Sykes has more.
Military cooperation that could come with economic benefits. As Turkey deploys troops to Libya, Ankara is also setting its sights on natural gas reserves in the hotly contested waters of the East Mediterranean, worth an estimated $700 billion, according to the US Geological Survey. Turkey struck a deal with Tripoli in November, promising military support for its fragile government in return for important geostrategic shifts. The accord aims to create an exclusive economic zone from Turkey's southern Mediterranean shore to Libya's northeast coast. The new maritime boundary line has bolstered Turkey to lay claim to a huge chunk of the East Mediterranean, rattling its neighbours in the region, racing to exploit recently discovered natural gas reservoirs. It has thrown a spanner in the works of an agreement between Cyprus, Greece and Israel, designed to ship natural gas from offshore fields in the East Mediterranean to mainland Europe. For them, the move is a cynical attempt by Turkey at a resource grab in a bid to scupper the pipeline. Egypt, which has also invested heavily in energy exploration in the region, has expressed alarm over the Turkey-Libya deal, dismissing it as illegal. Ankara has been excluded from energy developments in the East Mediterranean for some time due to its political differences with other nations. With a new ally in the region, Turkey has sent a message that it will not be ignored.
Borzu Dargai, ironically enough, you're in Istanbul, where we're on the eve of a sit-down between Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. What's that going to be about, and how much of it will have to do with natural gas? It seems like when you see that report we just watched, there's a scramble for gas in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, indeed, that is one of the things they will be discussing is the Russian-Turkish so-called Turk Stream pipeline that is supposed to come from the Caucasus through Turkey to the Aegean Sea. This has been in the works for some time. They have other things to discuss, the situation in Syria. I'm sure they'll talk about the crisis with Iran. And I think that they will find themselves talking also about Libya, where they find themselves yet again, like in Syria, on opposite sides of a armed conflict in the Arab world.
They're on opposite sides. Where's the common ground? What with those Russian private mercenaries from Wagner?
You know, it's hard to figure out where they find common ground. I think that to a large extent, this is going to sound controversial, but Vladimir Putin is a master kind of manipulator, and he's able to sort of get his cake and eat it too. I don't know how he does it with countries like Turkey and Iran and a few other countries, but he manages to, sort of violate these countries' strategic aims, make deals with their enemies, yet remain on good terms with them. He should be giving France and the United States some lessons on this kind of Machiavellian diplomacy. So it's not clear how he manages to do it, but he does.
He manages to do it, but what about Turkey? Let me ask Anas El-Gamadi, were you surprised to hear that Turkey was going all in, and that we saw that Turkey's foreign minister over the weekend in Algiers alongside the new Algerian president there, they're siding with the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. What's going on?
Well, they certainly have a vested interest now. I mean, the vested interest is literally almost $7 billion worth of interest in the Eastern Mediterranean. They also do share those opponents, like the UAE, for example, that are now on the other side of this conflict. They share those opponents in different parts of the world, like the Horn of Africa, for example, and they've also clashed over recent years. In 2016, President Erdogan accused the UAE of being behind the coup attempt in Istanbul. So there are many, many reasons there where they find themselves. But I would also say that the Turkish foreign policy now is also being determined by its economic needs. And it has a vested interest in making sure that the government of national accord doesn't collapse. And I think, again, there are many, many reasons why this has been going on. But I think it was Turkey almost doing the job that the UN Security Council and others have refused to do over the last 8 or 9 months. They've not come to the beck and the help and the rescue of the government of national accord, and they found themselves kind of needing one another. And I think Libya doesn't necessarily need this maritime agreement, but it certainly needs military support that it's been receiving over the last couple of months, and now it looks to try and scale up. I think that the big question for me has been how much of this is disguised what has already been going on for the last 8 or 9 months, and also the narrative in Libya. Is this a power grab by Haftar and Russia and the UAE and Egypt and others that are supporting Haftar's move on Tripoli? Is it a counter-terrorism operation, as your other guest has alluded to? It sounds to me like the boy who cried wolf, because at certain moments, we only had 2 days ago, there was a strike on Tripoli that killed 34 or around 30 military cadets, young children of the age of around 16, 17. The LNA came out and took responsibility. Its Colonel Mahjoub came on television and took responsibility for it. The LNA spokesman, only 6 hours later, denied this and said that it was ISIS that was behind a coordinated airstrike somehow. So I think it's very, very difficult, because we're being pulled in so many different directions, and there are so many geopolitical repercussions when you start mixing power grabs, counter-terrorism operations, and you have a very, very crowded theatre now in Tripoli.
Crowded theatre, and what you do see, Anas, is there are the countries that are sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, Qatar on one side, and those that are dead set opposed to them, the Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia on the other. Is that what this is about, really?
Well, they certainly need to try and make Turkey and Qatar relevant here. Qatar being an early sponsor of the Arab Spring, Turkey now with its move into Tripoli. But those countries were not involved in the last 5 years in Libya. Very little involvement, if whatsoever. The GNA itself spent most of its time actually in Abu Dhabi, in Paris, in Egypt, meeting alongside Sisi, meeting alongside Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. So it's only become a question that they're now Muslim Brotherhood after they fell out with Khalifa Haftar and Khalifa Haftar launched his offensive on April 4th. It certainly needs to be that narrative because the other narrative isn't so convenient. This is a power grab, that it's an attempt to try to return Libya to some form of authoritarian rule. But even that in its sense is going to be difficult because there is so much pluralism, not only in Western Libya on the side of the GNA, but also inside Haftar's camp. How do you try to keep, or how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again when you have one man at the helm that refuses to share power at all? You have in Eastern Libya a separatist sympathetic army. I mean, that army has been there since 2013. It almost declared secession in October 2013 and created a government under Ibrahim Jadran, who rose to fame after he blocked Libya's oil terminals. You now have parts of this army that are sympathetic to the Gaddafi regime and view Haftar maybe opportunistically today, but tomorrow they also have this kind of problem they had with him in 2011. So there are so many things going on there, but I would say that Libya's real problem today is pluralism.
Romano Garchinska, you have Khalifa Haftar back in April. He launches this offensive. He gets to the suburbs of Tripoli. It looked like he was going to make this quick dash for the capital. It didn't happen.
I don't think he was really expecting to do that so quickly. No one can do that,
he told
especially
his backers
on
he was
a
going
capital.
to do it. He told everyone.
So it is really not realistic to think that it could happen so quickly. It was the announcement, yes. And there is a lot of narratives about Libya and about what should happen, what happened, or what didn't happen.
Zero-hour campaigns.
And in a conflict, in a war, the first victim is information. So we have to be very careful about that.
What is, at this point in time, General Haftar, with all this foreign support, and we haven't yet talked about from other quarters, including the accusation that France is directly supporting Haftar. We will in a moment, but with all this foreign support, do you take Anas al-Gamadi's point that Muammar Gaddafi left Libya where you have all these different tribes and you're not going to have one unified force that can agree on everything?
Gaddafi left Libya without even a strong army, because the army was the inside enemy. Most of the attempts to kill, to overthrow Gaddafi from power was organized by members of the army. And even Khalifa Haftar spent 20 years abroad trying to organize attempts to overthrow Gaddafi. So there was not really a real army very strong to support this transition, to take care of this country. And the most important is that after the revolution, it was decided just to put them aside, saying, oh, they are just Gaddafis, and we will take the militias to take care of the security. And from after this decision, all the problems started because no one knew exactly who were these militias.
So, all right,
it was not under control and so on.
So, in other words, are we headed, as Anas is hinting, towards, a breakup of Libya with an eastern part and a western part?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because there is people from western part who are supporting the parliament or Haftar, and also there is people from eastern part supporting GNA. So it's really very mixed, and saying that, Gaddafis are on one side and are supporting just LNA and Haftar, it is not the whole reality, because you have two main figures of Gaddafi time who supported Gaddafi till the last minute in the government of Sarraj, which are Mr. Siala and Mr. Jahemi. They are important ministers of this government.
Claudia Gazzini, do you agree?
Well, yeah, I agree that Libya certainly will not be divided on one simple fact, that the ideology of this Arab nationalist ideology that permeates the LNA, or now the renamed Libyan Arab Armed Forces, really is not set in staying in eastern Libya. Their target is Tripoli. So I think the risk is not of a division, but just an ongoing escalation, an ongoing war to reach the target. The problem now is finding a common ground where a political solution can be forged. And unfortunately, the current circumstances where one side feels that they're strong and they can still advance militarily despite the setbacks of the 9 months, the other side, the Tripoli-based government, now feeling strong because of Turkish support, they're both just talking the language of war. But actually, a future of Libya needs some space and some compromise, and needs a political solution that brings the country together. Division will not bring an end to the war.
France denies that it's supporting General Haftar. We saw, though, that there were French special forces killed inside of Libya a few months back. What is your reading, Claudio Gazzini, of France's role?
Well, France has been a strategic ally of Haftar since 2014, 2015, when it actually took part in counterterrorism operations with the LNA. And then in that context, the French fighters were killed in a helicopter crash. I happened to be in eastern Libya that day when that happened. And the support has continued in terms of collaboration, in terms of intelligence, in terms of political support. It was France that really strongly backed the LNA when the LNA advanced into the oil crescent, this oil-rich area, in 2016. And there's constantly been sort of some cheerleading from some French authorities, be it the foreign minister or the president, for Haftar up until today. And I think France is now a bit more skeptical, perhaps, on the capabilities of the LNA to advance and take Tripoli, and their actual chances of winning militarily this war, and therefore has moved slightly over towards supporting more a political solution. But it certainly sees Haftar and that constituency that he represents as an integral part for a future settlement of Libya. Whether France is providing weapons still for the advance on Tripoli remains ambiguous. I can't comment on that. But France has provided equipment, and directly or indirectly, to Haftar-led forces for counterterrorism operations, and who knows whether they're still doing that.
And Boursa Dargahi, we're on the eve of another meeting, this one in Cairo, that's going to involve the foreign ministers of France, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. What's the calculus for Emmanuel Macron? What's that meeting about?
I mean, I think that they're nervous about the Turkish moves. Erdogan has kind of changed the game a bit with his, up until now, all of the aid that has been funneled into Libya has been relatively covert. On Sunday evening, Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced in a press appearance on CNN Turk that we're going to start sending, personnel to Turkey. My sources near the Turkish government tell me they're going to send radar jamming, very sophisticated, highly sophisticated radar jamming equipment that is supposed to render the precision weapons capabilities of the UAE forces useless. It's been used against the Russians. It's been used a couple times, they say, even against the Americans in Syria. And this equipment is, I think, frightening to some of the Haftar's backers. They're going to be discussing that. They're also nervous about this deal, this maritime and security deal, which is considered a direct affront to the EU partners as well as to Egypt and the UAE.
When you see that France and Turkey have been on opposite sides when it comes to the recent intervention across the border in Syria, when you see that Greece and Cyprus are very nervous indeed over that maritime deal that you mentioned, what's the future hold in relations between Turkey and the EU?
Well, I mean, there's been tensions between Turkey and the rest of the EU for, over the period of the decades. And I think that, in speaking to my EU contacts, it's better to have them on side and have, severe disagreements with them than to have them, completely seduced by Putin or China and have them, join an entire global bloc altogether. So I think that there is a balancing act that the diplomatic community has to play with regard to Turkey. Turkey is going to pursue its interests, and the Europeans are going to go headstrong for theirs as well.
Claudio Gazzini, what about Italy? Who are they backing in all of this?
Well, traditionally, Italy, at least for the past 4 years, Italy had been closer, of course, to the Tripoli-based authorities, the GNA, the UN-backed government. They're one of the few Western countries that actually operates an embassy in Tripoli. But over the past year, there have been overtures to Haftar. Contacts have remained. The new Italian foreign minister has visited also Haftar. He's the most recent Western official to have visited Haftar in his base in eastern Libya recently. So Italy is really trying now to play this game of a bridge between the GNA and Haftar. Italy, of course, has a grudge against the Turkish the uptick of the Turkish involvement in the Libya file, also in relation to Eastern Mediterranean gas deals, of which Italy, its oil company Eni, is a partner of. So, of course, Italy takes a similar position as to those of Greece and France in condemning the maritime deal, and is very worried at the risk of an escalation in Libya triggered by the Turkish intervention, because it's aware of the possible regional backlash that this military intervention could create.
Anas El-Gamadi, Italy, a former colonial power, the Ottoman Empire before that, so in a sense, Turkey. But does history matter in all of this?
Well, I suppose it matters to a certain degree, but the recent history since April 4th matters entirely more. And I think that's where I would focus my attention, that the combination of factors that took place on April 4th have led us here. And those factors, if they persist, mean that there is absolutely no way that there is going to be a deal. And the first is that France, I think, has offered diplomatic immunity to both Haftar, to the UAE and Egypt, that are continuing, given its seat in the UN Security Council and its seat in the European Union. It's almost neutered any ability or any diplomatic body's ability to condemn or criticize or sanction Haftar or any of his affiliated forces and his backers. Now, given that is the situation that the UN-backed government that Libya finds itself in, how do they try to stop or at least try and curtail Haftar's move on Tripoli, and then at the same time trust in the UN's process as an honest broker, as a neutral third party? So there may be meetings in Egypt, there may be meetings in Berlin that we're hearing that could take place in the next year. But unless there is movement at the international level to begin to alter what looks like a very one-sided move to support Haftar, then there's no way that we can create some form of negotiation table that at least the UN-backed government or any of its affiliated forces trust as not only a destination but as a process. That's the real difficulty here. I think we can often get too much or embroil too much in our ancient history and forget what's happening at the very moment that we're staring on almost a crisis that has got legs. This could be years if unless the international community changes its position on Libya.
Rumania Ugarczynska, how do you find a diplomatic solution, not a military one, to this? Or is there only a military solution?
First, you have to ask to the Libyans. And obviously, Libyans too are not keen to find another solution than fighting right now. And it is a disaster. It is a disaster for Libyans, and it is a disaster for all the region. And it is a disaster because each of the important competitors of the big international powers have their own champions and giving support and pouring arms without knowing where these arms will
eventually wind up. Claudio Gazzini?
Yeah, I think that at the moment, of course, there's very little space for political negotiation and convincing the two sides to go to the negotiating table. What is key to sort of pressuring the parties to reach an agreement, of course, is the position of the foreign powers. And as long as they are funneling weapons, providing more military support, providing financial support, there's very little incentives actually for the Libyans to reach a compromise. Eventually, Libya will need a sort of total reset of its political structure. But now it's hard to see how the German initiative, the Berlin conference that has been proposed, or UN sort of formats for negotiations can have make any inroads as long as weapons are coming in.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Much more to talk about, though. Claudia Gazzini, I want to thank you for joining us from Rome. I want to thank Anas El-Gamati in London, Borzu Dargahi in Istanbul, as well as Romania Ugarczynska for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.